Let me introduce first panelist, Dr. Enikő Bolobás, a professor of Department of American Studies of Eötvös Loránd University. The title of her presentation is The Legacies That Still Shape Our Lives in Central Europe. Please.
Thank you very much, Miklós. I think I'm going to go over there because I prefer standing. Is this turned on? It was turned on and it still is. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to talk about some particular aspects of our Central European societies, basically how we lived, how we actually conducted our lives at the time. And then first I will take or make some general remarks just to remind ourselves what everything was like, and probably not all of you lived here with us. And then I will go on and discuss two particular aspects. One, how those regimes affected intellectual life in this region, and how those regimes affected the lives of women in that region. So we are one generation away from 1990. Just about exactly one generation away. And I can see that my students who are in their early 20s have managed to not remember. Of course, it wasn't their own experiences, but there's a very healthy, it seems, in quotation marks, healthy process of forgetting. So probably it is fitting to take a cursory glance of how we actually lived during the Cold War, since that is the topic of our conference. In the 1950s, a large percentage of the population in Central and Eastern Europe was directly affected by some form of Stalinist repression. In Hungary, for example, this number was 10%, with the families of those Hungarians who were either imprisoned or in labor camps or lived with their families forcefully relocated. In the 1960s, prisons still held thousands without trial since 1956, and this date is significant for both Poland and Hungary. Since it was only legal to execute people above 18, thousands were kept on the death row for years so that they could be executed once they ceased to be minors. In 1968, the Warsaw Pact troops crushed the Prague Spring, with a cheering press rejoicing all over the Eastern Bloc over this new manifestation of socialist brotherhood. In the 1970s, the respective communist socialist parties still oversaw every promotion decision from factories to universities, every granted passport to the East and the West, and every book and article to be published in any field. Among the many forms of discrimination practiced at the time, the least violent one gave preference to families of trusted political cadres, supposedly workers or of worker and peasant families, when admitted to colleges, not giving others who perhaps scored better a chance. Such practices had long-term effects. They built the next generations of the power elite based on birth and not work. At this time, lar pour lar, random police beatings were still in fashion, rather common in the streets. I have very vivid memories of going home from soccer games with my friends in middle school, let's say, and the police hit anyone they could get on the side rows. In the 1980s, the secret police still checked our mail and bugged our homes. Actually, they were most active at this time in bugging and checking and tapping. They tapped our telephone conversations and those we carried on inside our homes. We would never get a mail on a Monday, for example. Now, I wonder if you know why. Well, the boys had their weekends off too. You know, they were government, state employees, and they had their weekends off. So I never got mail on Mondays. None of my friends got mail on Mondays. It wasn't even worth checking the mailbox. Informers hired by the secret police received their last paycheck in 1990. In Hungary, it was in May 1990, right before the new government took office, but 2 months after the government was elected into office. By this time, administration officials, especially in the sensitive branches and closer to the inner party, could have the opportunity to destroy all evidence relating to their past and come out with a clean slate. In Hungary, János Kádár was the party chief responsible for Hungary's 30-plus years of goulash communism. Having learned a bitter lesson from the uprising of 1956, he introduced special methods to make Hungarians swallow communism. Thus, a soft version of dictatorship was invented. That is, in return for benefits unparalleled in the Eastern Bloc, Hungarians became Kádár's accomplices in the common effort to live better. Historians call this political gesture of Kádár's his significant wink. Let us not provoke Moscow's anger, the wink said. Promise me that no more 56s occur, and in exchange, I will make you the star country on the block. Journalists and historians at the time bowed to Kádár's subtle demands. They were silent on his personal taboo topics, and the number one such taboo topic was 1956, Imre Nagy. And in order to strengthen Kádár's good grades in the Kremlin, they never referred to the Hungarian minorities in the neighboring countries. Kádár's eager yes men in the press enthusiastically condemned aggression in 1967, spoke about brotherly help to the Czechoslovak people in 1968, cheered over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and shed real tears, really real tears, when reporting the funeral of Leonid Brezhnev. Not a single Hungarian journalist or television commentator dared to ask substantive questions. Only the most trusted journalists were even allowed to get close to politicians, but even they were not so trusted as to get permission to conduct live conversations with politicians. The genre of the talk show was itself banned from this region until the very last year of socialist rule, 1989. At this time, foreign loans originally taken for infrastructural investments, but then spent on consumer goods, granted higher living standards to Hungarians than what the country's real economic output would have allowed. For decades, Hungary under communist leadership was, to use the words of the Hungarian-born Harvard economist János Kornai, eating up its tomorrow and thus discounting the future. The consequences were bitter indeed. In 1990, Hungary had the highest per capita debt in Europe. These were the general remarks. In the rest of my talk, I would like to discuss two particular aspects of Cold War societies, how intellectual life was affected and how women were affected by this everyday total control. Just like anyone else in these totalitarian states, scientists, scholars, academics, writers, they all depended on the state for its cultural patronage. The cultural commissars maintained a firm grip on what scientific or scholarly research could be conducted, what university college courses could be taught, and certainly what books could be translated and published by the state-owned companies, overseen by censors of all kinds. The cultural commissars monitored classroom activities by several methods. By controlling who could be hired in schools and universities, excuse me, by using student moles and instructor moles at various departments, and even by tapping classrooms in colleges and universities. My school, ELTE, moved to the buildings of the former Socialist Party Academy in 1991. And we were somewhat surprised to find listening devices, probably they are still there, listening devices. They were not out of order already by then. But by these listening devices, you could listen what was going on in 5-6 classrooms, 5-6 offices. So these officials, it seems, didn't even trust each other. This creep extended to what people could read as well. Again, several methods were available here, from not publishing certain authors, to not allowing libraries to carry certain books, to confiscated unwanted foreign publications. When in 1982 I returned from a semester in New York, I had 26, I think, books confiscated from me at the border, and they took everything, not just Solzhenitsyn and Churchill, that I could understand, but everything, Betty Friedan, and all my literary books too. So it is worth taking a look at what could not be translated and published in Hungary during the years of communism. Here is a list, tentative and random, of the missing authors, those which were blacklisted by cultural commissars. Philosophers Whitehead, Toynbee, Koestler, Bataille, Derrida, Foucault, Bachelard. Psychologist Freud, Jung. Not a single Freud, not a single Jung appeared during the socialist years. Erikson, Maslow, Lacan, as well as, actually in particular, the Hungarian-born giants, Ferenczi, Bertalanffy, Kerényi. Saussure had to wait 50 years to be published in Hungarian. Structuralism, for some strange reason, was anathema in the eyes of the socialists. If somebody could please explain that to me, I would love that. Apart from, yes, it was not Marxist, but actually it was nearly Marxist. Anyway, Martin Buber, and Wittgenstein had to wait 40 years. Martin Buber and Elie Wiesel were too Jewish to appear at all. Teilhard de Chardin and Karl Rahner probably too Catholic. Mahatma Gandhi was perhaps too civilly disobedient and non-cooperative. Betty Friedan and all the others too feminist. Ezra Pound, the American poet, was indexed by one particular poet translator, a cultural commissar of sorts himself, who pledged not to allow a collection of Pound's translations appear as he, the poet commissar, was alive. And that really, indeed, was so. Moreover, a whole infrastructure of cultural production was missing too. Encyclopedias, thesauruses, word finders, critical and annotated editions, anthologies of literature and criticism, the basic tools of intellectual work remained unborn. Now let me move on to my final topic, women. First, I would just like to make two general points, two basic claims, theses that I will build my argument on. Women in Central and Eastern Europe were affected by a double legacy based on pre-World War II patriarchal and post-World War II communist traditions. Thesis number two, the social benefits women enjoyed during communism strengthened already existing patriarchal mentalities. Pre-1945 Central and Eastern European societies were clearly patriarchal, offering limited choices to women, stressing traditional feminine ideals, and in general, locking women in subordinate roles. True, Western societies, Western Europe and the US, also revealed many symptoms of their own patriarchies at this time. But in the West, in the 1960s, patriarchy was substantially dismantled by the civil rights movement. East of the Iron Curtain, however, the 1960s were not the 60s, as usually understood. These 1960s were characterized by the tightening of police control and the lack of any civil rights politicization whatsoever. Here, the 1960s was not the decade of emergent feminism, demands for social equality, or the critique of racism and sexism. At best, our 1960s were characterized by a belated disillusionment among leftist intellectuals in communism, triggered by the Prague events in 1968, not actually the uprising itself, but its crushing by Warsaw Pact tanks. So the real 60s had to wait until after the fall of communism and its totalitarian regimes. And during this time, the pre-World War II patriarchy became only more solid in Eastern Europe, surviving as an undercurrent to what looked on the surface as emancipation. True, state socialism's own women's lib did happen, yet it was anything but liberation. It was rather one last gasp of patriarchy, paternalistic state socialism, beautifully resonating with pre-war mentalities. Communism indeed created an Orwellian world. The various benefits women enjoyed in the communist societies, such as full employment, free health care, 3-year maternity leaves, and cheap abortion, have all proved to backfire. These communist accomplishments all proved to be myths. The myth of full employment put women into underachieving jobs. The myth of health care, free health care, left them with rapidly deteriorating health and a complete lack of health awareness. And the myth of social benefits also just strengthened patriarchal mentalities. Because what is behind the myth of full employment, for example? These are the facts. Only 6.1% of women had college or university degrees in 1990. 70% of all women had 8 years of schooling or less. 54% of women had on-the-job training only. And 62% of women did secretarial work or clerical work. As a feminist, I have been extremely skeptical about the supposedly benevolent social benefits of communism, because they bred dependence both on the state and, in the case of women, on men. And just to finish, in conclusion, one should admit that it is always difficult to assess the nature of the times for contemporaries. These are transitory times that we live in still. They seem to be haunted by the times they follow rather than determined by the times they precede or prepare. Retrospective rather than anticipatory. probably Françoise Thom, Sorbonne's history professor, is right in using the metaphor of Chernobyl as the metaphor, as the image for our times. Communism ends like Chernobyl, leaving radioactive material all around, needing decades or centuries to decompose. But before the actual cleanup, it is necessary that we know exactly what radioactive waste we are dealing with. We have to start objectively estimating the various legacies of communism without prejudice, without bias. And this assessment must include identifying the legacies that have affected our intellectual life as well as the lives of women. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. Of course, after all panels, there will be opportunities to ask and comment. Now I would like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Katalin Kádár-Lin, who is a historian specializing in relation between the United States and Central and Eastern Europe during World War II and the Cold War. Her title of her presentation is The Cold War Legacy of Béla Varga and the Hungarian National Council. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I start my talk, one of the things I wanted to share with you that this presentation is a brief extract from a chapter in a book titled Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare, in which I have a chapter on the Hungarian National Council, and my colleagues Anna Mazurkiewicz and Francis Raschka also both contributed to this compendium, which essentially deals with organizations sponsored by the National Committee for a Free Europe Committee, which is what I'm going to talk about, the Hungarian National Council today, and how U.S. policy, United States policy, was implemented through support for exile organizations. And before I get into talking about the Hungarian National Council, I just want to talk a little bit about the scope of the National Committee for a Free Europe, later Free Europe Committee, because there are so many organizations about which we read in history books and in topical literature that were actually funded through the National Committee for a Free Europe, including the International Peasant Union for its entire existence, the Christian Democratic Union of Central and Eastern Europe, and the Union of Free Trade Unionists in Exile, East European Free Trade Unionists in Exile, Congress for Cultural Freedom. So there were many other organizations sponsored by the National Committee for Free Europe Committee other than the national councils. Led by Monsignor Béla Varga, the Hungarian National Council was one of the first organizations formed by Central European émigré political leaders fleeing the communist takeover of their nations at the end of World War II. Initially funded through the United States Department of State, and later through the National Committee for a Free Europe, covertly financed by the Central Intelligence Agency, it operated as a virtual government in exile. The influence of the HNC and its leadership throughout the hot period of the Cold War, but also during the period of emerging détente, cannot be underestimated, and is one of the lesser-known aspects of the program of inauguration of organized political warfare that was launched by U.S. policymakers in their policy of containment a few years after World War II's end, to counteract Soviet expansionism and propaganda worldwide. In order to evaluate the Cold War legacy of the Hungarian National Council, a brief history of its sponsoring organization is in order, particularly the early years of the Cold War, when liberation of the Soviet satellite nations of Central and East Europe was still a U.S. policy goal. U.S. Cold War policy to counter Soviet expansionism was presented in a top-secret memorandum titled The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. You're not going to want to hear that one more time. To the United States National Security Council on the 30th April 1948. Authored by U.S. diplomat and expert Soviet hand, then heading the Department of State Policy Planning staff, George F. Kennan. This was in his Hawk period before he became a Dove. I might add, he lived to be 102, and when you live that long, I think you can change your mind several times politically. But it proposed a three-point program for, quote, liberation committees, underground activities behind the Iron Curtain, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world, unquote. Kennan outlined both overt and covert action that should be taken, including, quote, a public committee which would give support and guidance in U.S. interests to national freedom movements publicly led by outstanding political refugees from the Soviet world, unquote. In this position paper, Kennan stressed, and here's a picture of Kennan with President Harry S. Truman, George Lovett, and Chip Bolin, Charles Bolin at the White House in 1947. In this position paper, Kennan stressed that covert political warfare must be controlled by the State Department but not be physically located therein, in part because the funds needed for such an operation could not be hidden in the State Department's budget. Therefore, I'm quoting him again, therefore this operation must find cover elsewhere. The cover was found with the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, and it was funded through the CIA throughout its entire existence. How did Kennan envision the policy of these national committees? They called them liberation committees, by the way, originally. To form centers of national hope and revive a sense of purpose among political refugees from the Soviet world, to provide an inspiration for continuing popular resistance within the countries of the Soviet world, and to provide a potential nucleus for all-out liberation movements in the event of war. That's pretty hawkish, don't you think? As a result, whoops, can we go backward? Thank you. As a result, the National Committee for Free Europe, National Committee for Free Europe, later Free Europe Committee, was formed and incorporated in the state of New York in 1949. The mission statement of the National Committee for Europe was to halt communism and save our freedom. It was established ostensibly by freedom-loving Americans as a not-for-profit. Its ties to the Department of State and U.S. intelligence were not known, and for many years were not known until 1968. And the NCFE leadership reflected the U.S. military, intelligence, diplomatic, and business communities. Here is the brochure produced by the National Committee for Free Europe. To halt communism and save our freedom. What you can do to halt communism and save freedom. The struggle for men's minds. Interestingly enough, in line with this whole public-private support of these organizations, you'll see in the corner an endorsement statement by Dean Acheson, then Secretary of State of the United States. So the public portion was never really quite well hidden. I want to mention a couple words about the NCFE leadership, because it included not just diplomats who were experienced with the Soviet Union, such as DeWitt Clinton Poole, and with the Axis and Central Powers, such as Joseph C. Grew, but intelligence officers such as Allen Dulles, a name familiar probably to many of you, who was chairman of its executive committee, military leaders such as Dwight D. Eisenhower, and even New Dealers from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, such as A.A. Burley. Business and community leaders were chosen based on their media and business influence and their known anti-communist stance, and they included Henry R. Luce of the Time Life media empire, and Spyro Skouras and Daryl Zanuck of Hollywood. Probably the quotation that I found that I best sums up how the national committees were viewed at that point, in the hot point of the Cold War, by the National Committee for Europe and U.S. policymakers. Director of Radio Free Europe, Robert Lang, to A.A. Burley, said he called them cold storage reservoirs for the day of liberation. So as of 1952, liberation was still in the forefront of U.S. policy. The Hungarian National Council, simultaneously with the National Committee for Free Europe, the Hungarian National Council was formed in 1947 at the encouragement of the State Department. It was headed initially or organized by Tibor Eckhart, who'd been in involuntary exile in the U.S. since 1941. And the executive committee included Eckhart, Ferenc Nagy, Zoltán Pfeiffer, Dezső Zsílyok, and Béla Varga. And Varga became its head at the same time. By 1947, when the council was formed, the trickle of Hungarian leaders arriving to the West had become a flood. I already said that. Tibor Eckhart formed the executive committee. I just want you to note that there were other national councils formed at the same period of time with the support of the U.S. Department of State, including the Council for Free Czechoslovakia, which is an area of Francis scholarship, the Bulgarian National Council, and the Romanian National Council. All were supported through subsidies provided by the United States Department of State. By the second month of its existence, actually 3 weeks after they were formed, through the support of the State Department, Hungarian leaders were given access to policymakers in Washington, D.C., and here we see them on the Capitol steps, visiting Congress, meeting with important congressmen, Senator Brian McMahon, and in their new office in Washington, D.C. Hungarian National Council had an office in Washington, D.C. It's interesting. What's interesting to look at this point in time, in the golden days of support for the Hungarian national councils, which after this period in the 50s somewhat fell out of favor, and the resources of the National Committee for Europe were turned more and more to funding Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were also elements of that operated under their purview. So there were, in 1954, 76 total members of the Hungarian National Council. There were 59 former members of Hungarian Parliament. There were 2 former prime ministers, several ministers, and former leaders representing the political parties purged between 1947 and 1949. They had offices and representatives in over 18 countries worldwide. This was all funded, and all of these people were in some way financially subsidized by American intelligence. Now, the role of the Hungarian National Council, because one of the reasons I wanted to cover this topic today is because I think we often have the vision that these emigre leaders in exile were provided financial funding. They met once a month and they talked about the good old days back home and what they were going to do when they returned to their home countries, and did nothing. This is not true. The Hungarian, and now I'm speaking only about the Hungarian National Council, they had their political goals. They wanted to promote the cause of liberation of their homeland. They wanted to call attention to the shortcomings of the Soviet system. And as a precursor to the collaboration that we see today within Central Europe and the Visegrad countries, they wanted to promote collaboration with other emigre organizations and councils to establish a stronger political voice for refugees from the Soviet satellites. And Anna's going to be talking about the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which played a very important role in this aspect. Hungarian National Council programs included advocacy and lobbying. Particularly, it was formed right before the Displaced Persons Act of 1948 was passed, allowing admission of thousands of Hungarian refugees to the United States. They were very involved with lobbying for the passage of that legislation. Humanitarian services, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but refugee relief and consular services. They operated refugee relief centers in 12 countries of Europe. In some countries, such as Austria and Germany, they had multiple offices, and they provided assistance upon the refugees' arrival in the United States or other destination. And I found some material in the archive that talked about how George Telegdi met every single ship that docked in New York Harbor that had Hungarian refugees, just to make certain that the refugees who were on that ship had someone to take care of them and transition them into handling their paperwork and their immigration data. So this was a hands-on grassroots organization. Cultural activities, I can only mention a cursory manner, but they maintained communication with Hungarian refugees worldwide. They promoted Hungarian language maintenance. They actually supported, I found more than 37 in the budgets, more than 37 Hungarian language publications that they funded worldwide, including the Hungarian language daily in the United States, Amerikai Magyar Népszava, which they also funded. Cultural programs, dance, music, theater, books, and publications. Humanitarian services. Oops, oh, I hear lobbying. I just wanted to show you a slide. Can we go back to the picture? Here's Monsignor Bela Varga. So Leslie Monroe, who was 3 times head of the United Nations Security Council. Who's there? I have to look at my. Oh, Christopher Emmett, who was president of the, or headed the Friends of the Captive European Nations, and Alexander Kut of Estonia, discussing their strategy regarding the question of Hungary at the United Nations. So they were very active in lobbying. Okay. Humanitarian services, refugee relief, and consular services. This was a very important aspect because these are the programs that touched refugees' lives on a daily basis. Their refugee services were actually critical for providing services for the most needy of the refugees, including invalids, elderly in exile. There were tuberculosis patients in refugee camps in Europe from 1945 until 1953 who had been in displaced person camps for 6 to 7 years. Legal services, employment placement, translation of documents. Let's remember that most of the people who arrived in the West did not speak the language of the country in which they arrived. And most of them did not have all their documents. They provided help in this way, intervention with immigration and other authorities, and as I said, grassroots services, just providing money for weddings, for funerals. Yeah, weddings do come before funerals. Weddings, funerals, and medical expenses, clothing and financial aid, and everything from eyeglasses to transportation. Support for education was very important because particularly after 1956, the great mass of the young people who arrived the refugees who arrived abroad were young people of university age or close to university age. And a great number of scholarships were obtained for those refugees. They also founded the Free European University in Exile in Strasbourg, France, which operated actively for about 6 or 7 years. And there's a great chapter about it in this book written by Veronika Durin-Hornig, who's a young Hungarian scholar obtaining her PhD in Paris. But she's done some wonderful research. They offered language courses in all their principal refugee centers, and they provided financial support for Union of Hungarian Students, Nemzetőr, and the Hungarian Scouts Ex Terris, which is to this day an extremely healthy program for youth of Hungarian descent that operates worldwide. Aid to Hungary, I just condensed this a little bit. The famous ICA packages, which I think maybe some of you remember. I don't know if everybody does, but I remember paying for them and not very much arriving at the other end. But thousands of them were sent to Hungary annually under the auspices of the HNC. Over 10,000 aid packages were sent to Hungary through the first Aid for Hungary campaign after the Hungarian Revolution, which Tibor Eckhart ran. And probably the most successful, and I'm sorry to gloss over it because it's a terribly important aspect of, and the most successful program that was ever instituted was the books program, the book distribution program, which existed from 1950 to 1991. There's a great book titled Hot Books in the Cold War by Alfred Reich. During this period, over 1 million books and periodicals were sent to Hungary, free of charge. All those authors that you were talking about who were on the banned list, and many others. And you'll note that the program actually was effective until 1991, operated until 91, at which point over 10 million books and periodicals had been sent in free of charge to this part of the world and to the USSR. So, in conclusion, or winding up, I just want to say a few words about Monsignor Béla Varga. The HNC was considered the best managed and organized of the national councils, in no small part due to the consistent leadership of Monsignor Béla Varga, its president, throughout its existence. Varga managed the discordant and often fractious refugee leaders, opposing agendas, personal rivalries with patience and aplomb throughout the 24 years he led the organization. He agreed to absorb the leadership of the 1956 revolution, many of them far to the left of the HNC's composition, into the HNC, which in 1958 changed its name to Hungarian National Committee to reflect their inclusion. His deep faith and his faith in the role of the HNC had to play in the geopolitics of the day in order to serve the cause of Hungarians is much to be admired, and its contribution should not be forgotten. The influence of the Hungarian National Council lasted beyond the life of the organization and influenced and encouraged the movement toward democratic change in Hungary today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. As a historian, I think it is a white spot in Hungarian historiography. It would be worth to publish in Hungarian language.
Yes, it is our intention to do so. In fact, I'd like to publish this entire book in Hungarian because I think it's an extremely useful tool for all scholars working in this area in the Cold War. Thank you very much.
I would like to welcome in Hungary our next presenter, Dr. Anna Mazurkiewicz from Poland. She's an assistant professor of University of Gdańsk. She's going to talk about East European lobby in the United States during the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Antall József Knowledge Center for having me. I really love coming to Budapest, and thank you for the invitation. After the conclusion of the Second World War, many East European political exiles escaping communist persecution found asylum in Western Europe and in the United States. In America, their presence was noticeable mostly in New York and Washington. The choice was not accidental, for the anti-communist activists wanted to continue their struggle against the Soviet domination, seeking help from both the United States and the United Nations. Their arrival was predated by 2, sometimes 3 generations of earlier economic migrants who sought to re-establish their lives in America. Mostly peasant migrants from the regions between Adriatic, Baltic, and the Black Sea shared not only demographic profiles, but also settlement patterns. By now constituting roughly 4.7% of American society, that would be 14.6 million by the 1990 census, with Poles alone, Polish Americans listed at 9.5 million. Since 1890s, the East European ethnic groups tended to settle in the corridor, which roughly stretches from Washington all the way to Boston and along the shores of the Great Lakes. Spatial concentration, blue-collar jobs soon became a political factor, mostly Democratic electorate. Early lessons of 1944, 1946 midterm elections, and 1948, however, show that the mobilization of ethnics as an electoral bloc was not easy. It is in this context that we must analyze the role played by the post-World War II cohorts, two, if not three, distinct waves of political exiles who left East Central Europe in mid-40s, after Yalta, or as a result of crisis of 1956, 68, 81. The two groups, the old immigrants, I should call them ethnic groups, and the post-World War II exile cohorts, or the émigrés, shared affection to their ancestral homeland, cultural, religious background. However, their social background, educational level, interwar political experience, and reasons for coming to the US were very different. All immigrations from East Central Europe since World War II had one feature in common: a high percentage of intellectuals and public figures. Their activities assumed double aspect: the drive to liberation of each nation from the alien rule and preservation of its culture, that being artistic, literary, academic, scientific work. Part of their so-called exile mission was also to keep the free world informed about the fate of their homelands. In my talk today, I will not discuss their activities and impact they had on their homelands. I'm not going to talk about humanitarian or intellectual aspects of their work. I will not talk about the Radio Free Europe, Kultura, or Svedectví. Rather, I shall focus on their political lobbying activities. In particular, I will look at the United States as it was the Americans who seriously put the region on the agenda of their international relations. While sometimes the exiles might be in fact significantly instrumental in initiating and advocating events, I'll just mention de Gaulle, Khomeini, while we are dealing with very influential lobbies created in the United States, like the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee established in 1963, or the Cuban-American National Foundation established in 1981, thus far, the East Europeans in the United States were largely written off. Their actions reduced to marginality, inconsequentiality, or total dependence or circumstance. Well, today I want to focus on one case study, the one that I know best, and that would be the ACN, Assembly of Captive European Nations. This is what my research focuses on. This is an organization that was created of the exiled political leaders from Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Well, by now you probably noticed there's no Ukraine, there's no Yugoslavia. The Assembly of Captive European Nations consisted of committees and councils that Dr. Kaderlin has described to you. It was established in 1954 under the aegis of the Free Europe Committee. It was at 29 West 57th Street in New York that this particular East Central European Information Center, discussion forum, quasi-parliament, as some exiles called it, and political lobby, speaking on behalf of 9 captive nations, they referred to it as a lobby speaking on behalf of 100 million people in Central Eastern Europe, established its seat. As I described the ACN, I would appreciate if I could have the images showing the content, the character of the message that was projected by them fly behind us here. Throughout its existence, the ACN strove to promote a concrete and seemingly very simple plan for East Central Europe: free elections and withdrawal of the Soviet troops. Crossing national lines in political activities in exile by creating this multinational assembly proved a tempting solution to the conflicts that marred all national groups of emigres. A former Free Europe Committee employee who actually worked with the exile groups in the United States wrote, and I quote, John Like, A political exile is a sui generis condition with its attendant frustrations, problems, and discouragements. In the absence of the electoral mandate, the political exile can only emphasize his differences with fellow exiles, and he begins to see victory in terms of favors or concessions he has extracted from the protecting power, end quote. Yossi Schein calls it the politics of schism. Claiming legitimacy, understood as remaining true to the old electorate, became the schism. Adopting transpolitical or multi-ethnic formula for political action helped to resolve this Gordian knot. Common enemy, ideas of federalism, inspiration for multi-ethnic forms of political activity brought about by Party International allowed the exiles to leave the national disputes behind and provided a common ground to fight for Europe whole and free. From the outset of its activities, the ACN coordinated its public events with the General Assembly meetings of the United Nations, of course, and with the schedule of the United Nations in general. Its yearly plenary sessions began concurrently with the UN sessions. They were organized in the Carnegie International Center, located at the corner of First Avenue, which is the UN Plaza, and the 46th Street. For more than 10 years, these meetings were advertised to and were met with the interest of both American and foreign journalists, as well by both American and foreign politicians and diplomats. Most importantly, however, the ACN wanted to inspire and possibly influence the US foreign policy. Hence, its leaders made frequent calls and appeals to the US government, tried to reach the American public via press and scholarly professional publications to generate the grassroots pressure, and finally, to find allies in the US Congress who would press for the American non-recognition of the status quo of Soviet domination in divided Europe, and thus maintain the interest in the fate of the peoples behind the Iron Curtain. Interestingly enough, the ACN operations are to be seen in a different light if we take into consideration the fact that this organization was technically a part of the Free Europe Committee. So as an organization allied with the Free Europe Committee, it was intellectually, or I might call it ideologically, supervised by the Department of State and financially supported by the CIA. We therefore seems to examine activities of a lobby consisting of non-American citizens, which in fact was an American organization, and this was an organization, even if distantly, connected to the American executive that actively worked, or desperately tried, to influence the American legislature in order to advance American anti-communism. And this is all being done for the benefit of a foreign and distant captive nations. Naturally, both the Free Europe Committee and the exiles saw the situation differently. For the Free Europe, the ACN was meant to, and here I quote, further political warfare objectives of Free Europe in the countries of interest behind the Iron Curtain. Second, to support the aims of the US government in the so-called uncommitted areas. Third, to contribute to the understanding and interest of the American people in the situation of captive nations and implant in them the conviction that it is in the American interest that these people be free. In President Eisenhower's propaganda advisors and one-time Free Europe Committee's president files, C.D. Jackson's, one may find documents in which the ACN is called an American propaganda agency and the people in it are not free. And this organization, the same set of files, is described as one that evolved from an organization meant to be giving advice on broadcasting policy and basically offering legitimacy to the Free Europe Committee operations, to the one that helped to keep the frustrated East European exiles busy. According to these papers, by 1963, the ACN was supposed to become a body to which the US officials and leading citizens could address expressions of sympathy for Eastern Europe and assurances of eventual change to come. Well, not surprisingly, the evaluation of the ACN's significance, both symbolic and practical, by the exiles was quite different. According to the exiles themselves, the ACN was an exile organization speaking in one voice for almost 100 million silenced peoples. That would be Willis Massens. the Latvian chairman of the ASEAN. Felix Gadomski, longtime Secretary General, called it a cooperation platform, which was created in order to be heard in the West. Stefan Korboński said, it's an alternative to the communist representatives in the United Nations, a legitimate representation of the captives in the free world. Honorable Janos Horvat said, it was a quasi-East European parliament in exile. Were there any other organizations of the sort, regional lobbies in the US? Of course there were. Suffice it to mention the Conference of Americans of Central and East European Descent, Party International, Federalist Clubs. Did they cooperate? Yes, they did. Interestingly enough, only the members of the ASEAN rejected naturalizations, that they wanted to retain their status. I find ASEAN most intriguing because of its symbiotic relationship with the US government. I want to ask a question, following the words of István Dek. Was the ASEAN a band of propagandists, window dressers for the US foreign policy? Or maybe were they more like the Cuban-American National Foundation, involved in something that might be called the power sharing? In order to have an effective ethnic lobby, the symbiotic relationship with the host government is essential. There are a couple of elements that surface in various literature pieces written both in America and in Eastern Europe that emphasize the following elements: shared policy preferences, that would be between the exiles and the host government. The ethnic lobby must be able to provide information, deliver the votes, and also deliver the money during the campaigns. For the policymakers, this public-private relationship results in the foreign relations agenda being formulated in a way that it actually supports the common cause. Together, the two sides, the symbiotic relationship must provide the education and communication of the foreign policy agenda to the public. So at the first glance, when we look at the East European lobby, well, we must consider it unsuccessful. We see the lack of real power, we see no resources, the exiles basically live off little stipends, $200, $300. Their blue-collar ethnics do not have the resources. The supporters of the exiles are back home behind the Iron Curtain. The ethnic ballot cannot be lobbied, cannot be mobilized to actually have an impact, and the high-level contacts are absent. All the way until 1970s, there's very little that the ethnics can claim as their own going on the Capitol Hill or in the White House. The big change starts to surface in the 1970s. So, discussing the impact of the East European lobby. Charles Mathias, in Foreign Affairs of 1981, wrote the following thing, discussing the lack of impact. And here I quote, "If achievement of stated goals is the measure of a lobby's success, the East European lobby must be accounted generally unsuccessful. The stated goal of such groups as the Assembly of Captive European Nations, freedom and full independence for the peoples of Eastern Europe, is no closer to attainment in 1981 than it was when the ASEAN was founded in 1954. The failure to achieve the ultimate objective does not, however, demonstrate either incompetence or ineffectiveness on the part of East European ethnic lobby. Liberation has not been achieved for the simple compelling reason that it cannot be achieved without incurring the risk of World War III." Let me supplement this opinion with the text written by Stephen Garrett, published about the same time, 1980. In it, the author lists the reasons for the failure of the East European ethnic lobby. The US government generally tends to ignore ethnic pressures, and there's a plethora of other lobbies trying to get its attention. The exiles, wrote Garrett,
They're having trouble translating.
We are trying to interpret you.
It's impossible.
sorry. Okay, the exiles were increasingly growing out of touch with the current developments in their countries. Their interests for which they were fighting were very peculiar and connected to the foreign land, not representing the American national interest. Their work was marred by internal splits, infighting, schism, as I called it, following Yossi Schein argument. The US ethnic electorate, being less concerned with foreign affairs than internal affairs, basically tended to be responsive to economic concerns and not foreign policy agenda. However, when we look at the ASEAN, we can easily see that this organization was united. It was global issues oriented. Themes like colonialism, federalism, communist global threat were reason. It did not focus on a particular interest of one country. It consisted of highly respectful politicians, of whom both members of the US Congress, UN, and Council of Europe spoke with respect and praise for their efforts. Its opinions expressed in the press, published studies or reports, periodical publications, were consulted, and to this day we can find them in close to 200 libraries around the United States. Despite the fact that they lacked ways and means to influence the public or even the ethnics, it did target the members of Congress who were vulnerable to electoral process, especially in their ethnic states. So when we examine the ASEAN, we see that this organization had some of the abilities, potential at least, to become an influential lobby. However, its strengths were also accompanied by considerable weaknesses, among them the dependence on the American political and financial support. The time was not on their side as well, as a new generation of leaders of opposition in East Central Europe took over. The new exiles, the new emigres, or the new opposition leaders decided they want to be in touch, but they would refrain from becoming part of this particular Council of Elders, a group that still consisted of respected statesmen, some of them surprisingly realistic in their approach, yet increasingly out of touch and out of physical powers as well, their numbers decreasing with each year. The ASEAN was also disconnected, strangely enough, from the ethnics. And by that, I mean that they did incorporate with ethnic organizations, but they were not part of the diaspora. Finally, the ASEAN did not have a large following, and limited knowledge about it existed among the ethnics. The ASEAN members intended to remain mostly a political representation and did not possess enough resources to organize popular rallying, which could have also been considered meddling in the internal affairs, as they were often branded the so-called foreign agents. This foreign agent aspect made the ASEAN vulnerable to policy shifts, while the lack of the widespread ethnic backing contributed to the lack of power independent of the American government. It was only in broad coalitions with other American and ethnic organizations that they could have had more impact, which they have tried repeatedly. Yet imposing their views on them was not really possible, less so getting the US government to listen or to consult. So, in conclusion, the ASEAN greatest impact or influence was the extensive array of published material that they prepared, disseminated, and promoted, even among the highest echelon of American power. It was discussed, mentioned, recommended in Congress, and as such, helped to educate and maintain interest in East Central Europe, promote the case of its freedom in America and beyond. However, when we are trying to see a direct political action to be taken by the US government that would be inspired by the ASEAN, directly or indirectly, say via the US congressmen or senators, is very hard to find. Now, there are a number of scholars like Yossi Schein, Eva Morawska, who focus on the so-called cumulative effect of the East Central European lobby in the American, that being putting the Eastern Europe on the mental map of the West, Yalta never getting out of sight. As I said before, by the 1970s and 1980s, new factors appeared that strengthened the East European lobby. We do have people like Brzezinski, Rauni, Baudyga, Gronowski, Muskie, and to go beyond the Poles, Albright, Charles Gatti, John Shalikashvili, a Pole, John Lęczowski. We have a number of Polish and East European congressmen being elected to the American Congress, and while they remain Americans first and last, they do have a soft spot for East Central Europe. Now, of course, As Igor Lucas writes, no exile organization can achieve greatness without some corresponding development at home. And this is what happened in the late 1970s after the Helsinki Accords. I'm going to conclude here. I think I've already abused the time limit. I wanted to close by saying two things. One is that during the debate, after our countries regained their freedom, during the debate in the American Congress, devoted to how our countries are ever going to get into NATO, we see finally the East Central lobby being successful, but it takes three parts in order for this lobby to finally succeed. This would be the free countries of East Central Europe that initiated and demanded membership. This is going to be the ethnic lobby and mobilizing and flooding the White House with their appeals, and the émigré leaders, which provided the background, the fact that for the 4 decades, the West was not given a chance to forget. So, referring to the morning panel, if we are trying to figure out what are the lessons learned during the Cold War in terms of Eastern European lobby in the United States, it is increasingly and still quite valid, important to remember that while the big powers are the big players, while we talk about cooperation or confrontation, wisdom when making decisions, attention must be paid to our region. The transatlantic relationship cannot just rely on the discussion of sentimental, or whether it's a sentimental or strategic relationship. It's both essentially important that there would be a regional cooperation in Central Europe, and that we do have the strengthening of the East Central European lobby in the United States, because these are the only true friends, strategic friends that we do have across the Atlantic. The United States does have the interests, and only occasionally are they congruent with our own. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, but we have to keep a schedule and time is going very fast. Now, let me introduce our next presenter, Francis de Raška, Associate Professor of Modern History, Institute of International Studies, Faculty of Social Science, Charles University in Prague. He's going to talk about the Bible smuggling to Eastern Europe during the Cold War, underground evangelism, and the Reverend David G. Hathaway. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I have to apologize for my hoarse voice. I'm getting over a cold and I'm drugged up, on cold wrecks and stuff, so please forgive me. I want to thank the hosts for inviting me here and for making this event possible. When one thinks of the Cold War, one has to realize that we are talking about people. We are talking about human suffering. We've heard a lot about politics. We've heard a lot about sort of political oppression. But when we think of religious oppression during the Cold War, and we think of private individuals, such as the Reverend David Hathaway, about whom I shall speak in a moment, we realize that not so much has been written about the private networks that did exist in order to alleviate spiritual or religious suffering in Central and Eastern Europe. I think I should also begin by saying, that the private groups who were involved and who did things, people in the West who risked their own lives by smuggling Bibles and religious materials into this part of Europe during the Cold War, undertook considerable risk, generally had very little political or other coverage, and as you shall find out from this talk, you'll see just how the Reverend David Hathaway, who is still alive, in his 80s now, but a native of the United Kingdom, you'll find out just how indifferent initially his own embassy was to him when he was arrested at the Czechoslovak West German border. Okay, let me begin. Religion and belief in God represented strong adversaries of communist ideology. In communist countries, discrimination against believers took many forms, and there were considerable differences in the severity of oppression in individual countries. Limiting the availability of Bibles and religious materials in general was one of the instruments of ideological repression employed by communist governments. During the Cold War, the invocation of God thus became central to Western ideological warfare against the Soviet bloc. The smuggling of Bibles into communist countries became a widespread activity that involved private groups from around the world, yet it remains mostly unknown, as I have mentioned. Most information originates from memoirs of the actors themselves or their admirers, and very few historical studies exist. Bible smuggling represented an example of transnational anti-communist cooperation. It was aimed at denouncing the violation of religious rights in communist countries. It organized an exchange of information among opponents of communism, and it facilitated the coordination of the activities of these opponents. The organizations involved in Bible smuggling were primarily Protestant. The first well-known smuggler was the Dutch factory worker Andrew van der Bijl, commonly referred to as Brother Andrew, who later founded the organization Open Doors. In the United States, the most prominent organizations were Underground Evangelism, founded by L. Joe Bass and his wife Lois, and Jesus to the Communist World, established by Romanian exile Reverend Richard Wormbrand. These organizations cooperated with the Center for the Study of Religion and Communism, later known as Keston College in London, founded by Reverend Dr. Michael Bordeaux and Sir John Lawrence. This institution was considered by the KGB to be one of the most dangerous anti-Soviet organizations. The aim of my talk is to shed some light on the American-based group Underground Evangelism and its associate Reverend David Gordon Hathaway, who was arrested in 1972 by the Czechoslovak authorities at the West German-Czechoslovak border for smuggling, and whose case reached the highest levels of Czechoslovak and British politics. In addition to some already published materials, original documents from archives in both the Czech Republic and Great Britain, as well as materials provided to me by Hathaway's Eurovision mission to Europe based in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, England, have been consulted. As already mentioned, the largest American Bible smuggling organization was Underground Evangelism, founded by L. Joe Bass. In 1960, they published Underground Evangelism magazine, and initially their goal was to assist needy pastors in the East Bloc. The beginnings were modest. Donations started to grow, and over the years, Underground Evangelism grew into a multi-million-dollar organization with offices in many countries. The development of Bible smuggling activities was initially based on information from Keston College. Later, the mentor of Underground Evangelism, a retired British Army colonel named Robert Thompson, established a clandestine network in the Soviet Union and provided information for Underground Evangelism magazine. Another useful contact was Lydia Breidenbach from West Berlin. The European operation of Underground Evangelism was organized by Dale Smith, who set up an office in Munich and started the East-West Information Center. The smugglers' success was based on maintaining secrecy among the individual smugglers. The individual couriers knew very little, and therefore, if caught, could not inform on the activities of others. Individual volunteers not only did not know the true identities of the others, in fact, they did not even know that Underground Evangelism organized and financed their activities. Although some of them were caught, they were usually promptly released. For smuggling of large deliveries, a core group of professional men was used. Accusations appeared that underground evangelism was supported by the CIA, but this was vigorously denied by both Lois and Joe Bass. Lois Bass, in her memoirs, claims that underground evangelism managed to deliver more than 40 million copies of Bibles and other religious publications to Eastern Europe over the course of its existence. It is interesting that Lois Bass fails to mention other important participants in the organization's activities, most notably the Reverend David G. Hathaway and Reverend Richard Wurmbrand, who ultimately would found his own organization. Now let me refer to the Hathaway affair. Among those whom Joe Bass recruited as professional Bible smugglers was Reverend David Gordon Hathaway, based in Dewsbury, England. Hathaway had been a pastor in the Elim Pentecostal Church, who in 1961 established a religiously inspired tour company called Crusader Tours Limited. Through this company, Hathaway organized overland tours to Jerusalem, continental Europe, and North Africa. In his book, Checkmate, Hathaway writes how he became involved with underground evangelism. At a meeting in London in 1964, Hathaway informed Bass about his previous delivery of small numbers of Bibles and New Testaments requested by friends in communist countries. Hathaway had had difficulties obtaining demanded numbers of Bibles and explained that Crusader Tours represented a perfect framework for Bible smuggling, as it was an established travel agency with buses traveling regularly and frequently to countries behind the Iron Curtain. A hidden compartment was constructed in a bus nicknamed Albert to smuggle the Bibles and religious materials. The first smuggling was made in December 1964 to deliver a special consignment of Bibles to believers in Romania in time for Christmas. Smuggling of Bibles continued until 1972. Although no documentary evidence has survived, Hathaway's present charity, the Eurovision Mission to Europe, claims that over 150,000 Bibles and New Testaments were brought across the Iron Curtain by his operation. After years of performing the smuggling activities without a hitch, the biggest smuggling operation was planned for June 1972. The bus would be loaded in Würzburg, West Germany. The next day it would cross into Czechoslovakia, and the Bibles were to be unloaded there, then cross into Austria to pick up a new load, travel through Hungary into Yugoslavia, and finally into Romania for the advertised tourist destination at the Black Sea. The total load could be delivered in this one round trip was meant to be 15,000 Bibles or 36,000 New Testaments. The planned trip began on June 19, 1972. The driver, David Loth, found out about the trip on the same day because the driver who usually drove this bus, Roger Fowler, became ill. There were 17 tourists on the bus. The route of the trip had been planned by the Czechoslovak travel agency, Čedok, in London. The bus crossed the channel from Dover to Ostend, Belgium, and from there proceeded to Würzburg, where an overnight stay had been arranged. On 21st of June 1972, the bus crossed the Czechoslovak border in Rozvadov. During routine customs control, an elaborately concealed space was discovered in which a large amount of religious literature was discovered. To shorten it, I will say, on the same day, the state security police was called and they decided to prosecute. On the 23rd of June, David Gordon Hathaway was accused of committing offenses of attempted sedition and attempted violation of customs regulation. Hathaway initially denied knowledge of the contraband, later reversed himself, but never did he betray others involved, either in Czechoslovakia or in other countries. Okay. The British consulate in Prague was informed about Hathaway's detention on 28th of June 1972, so a week later. The consul was in contact with a number of people at the Czechoslovak Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They were quite indifferent to Hathaway's plight until it became clear that people back in the United Kingdom were making a fuss about what had happened. On the 15th of July, the BBC broadcast to Czechoslovakia announced the detention of Hathaway. 3 days later, the report was repeated along with an extensive commentary on anti-religious activities of communist governments. It is interesting that the formal prosecution of Hathaway, which required 4 months of investigation to prepare, did not even have the middle name of the accused written correctly. Hathaway was informed on 11th October that his trial would take place on the 27th of October at the district court in Tachov. The court found Hathaway guilty as charged and sentenced him to 2 years imprisonment and subsequent expulsion from Czechoslovakia. It gets interesting. The British reaction to this was quite muted. Let me give you some examples. Brian Rose of the Consular Department summarized as follows: British subjects in foreign countries should obey the law or leave. In any event, I find it very difficult to believe that Mr. Hathaway did not know what he was doing and the risk he was taking. I have seen little evidence that public opinion in general has been swayed by his plight. It is worth remembering that while there might be some domestic political mileage in an approach to the Czechoslovaks, there might be more merit in holding firm to the principle that we and other countries have the right to make our own laws and have them respected by foreigners. The British were privately informed that Hathaway could be expelled by Easter 1973 if no public fuss were made. British newspapers started addressing the case thanks to his brother Kenneth, who informed the press of the Reverend's plight. Articles appeared in the Yorkshire Post, the Daily Telegraph. On 29th January 1973, a number of questions were raised in the British Parliament about the Hathaway case. Most notably, the Reverend Ian Paisley said that it's hard to believe that someone could be imprisoned simply for transporting Bibles and religious materials into a country. Let me just skip over here, okay. After much wrangling and bureaucratic wrangling, the leader of the opposition at this time in the UK, Harold Wilson, learned that Hathaway might be released soon. So he flew to Czechoslovakia and he was hosted by the communist authorities. Hathaway was subsequently released and he left Czechoslovakia on the same plane as Harold Wilson the following day. What did happen was that the conservative government of Ted Heath, which was already quite unpopular at the time, made sort of a fuss, and there were insinuations made that Wilson had made some promises to the Czechoslovaks about 1968 in order to secure Hathaway's release. In fact, it doesn't appear that any promises were made, and that the Czechoslovaks were more than happy to embarrass the Heath government by hosting the labor leader and sending this troublemaker out of the country, as they had planned to do the previous December, when they said that around Easter he should be released. Okay. Now let me just get you some ideas. Hathaway's release caused a storm in British political circles. On the 26th of April, Wilson wrote to Permanent Undersecretary of State Sir Denis Grenell. Last Tuesday, I am told that the Foreign Office News Department telephoned a number of journalists to rebut the factual statements I had made about the Reverend David Hathaway. I cannot recall any precedent for such action against a leader of the opposition before. Towards the end of the week, talks with Mr. Bullard were disclosed by the Foreign Office. It was flatly stated in the Sunday Telegraph that he had come to see me on my initiative and that he had put me in possession of all the facts about the Hathaway situation. This is not true. Mr. Bullard had met my parliamentary private secretary at a party and expressed great interest in the fact that I was due to meet very senior people in Czechoslovakia. He also mentioned the Hathaway question, and I told him the situation, including the understanding that I had been given that Hathaway would be released during my visit. To my mind, the most regrettable action of your officials related to the telegram I had sent from my press secretary from Prague. The gist of it was leaked to the press earlier this week and provided the basis for a headline and story centering on the word scandal. This does scandalize members of parliament, since it has always been understood that an MP, whether front or back bench, could send messages through the diplomatic channel when abroad without fear of disclosure. Life after the release of Reverend Hathaway. To make a long story short, Reverend Hathaway continued to work for underground evangelism until 1976. He undertook a number of speaking tours, and he also organized a campaign for the freeing of Soviet Baptist minister Georgy Vins. In the end, Vins was freed, and Vins was exchanged for 2 convicted Soviet spies and moved to the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last presenter, Dr. Ivo Samson from Slovakia, Director of Institute of Security and Defense Studies of Slovak Ministry of Defense. Title of his presentation is Slovakia as part of the West. Thank you. Of course.
Ready for standing. My speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation, of course, to the organizers. My topic has been, as you could hear, Slovakia as part of the West. It's very attractive. It's something we can speak hours about, or maybe days. We can convene a congress, not only a conference, to this topic. We should define, of course, what the West is. Is it only culture? Is it foreign policy orientation? Is it something else? Is it Western languages? Is it geographical position? That's something makes the West the West. Anyway, I will focus on Slovakia, seeing Mr. Miklos Derer having arrived some minutes ago. He may be remembered that some years ago we produced a book, Visegrad countries, the EU and Russia. And he was a contributor. So that one can see, according against the background of this book, how the situation has changed in between in these 4 years due to the shifting border between East and West. It doesn't concern Slovakia or Hungary or somebody else from the Visegrad 4. It concerns, of course, the unhappy Ukraine, which is a buffer zone between us and the East. Still, well, the time plays a big role here, because you need 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and the political situation is quite other. And you realize at this moment that the difference between East and West is in fact historical, so that you cannot erase it. Just look at me. Some 10 years ago, I was elected by the most read intellectual daily in Slovakia as one of 10 most sexy men of Slovakia. But you can see that it was many, many years ago. So that the situation has changed in between very rapidly. So that Slovakia, and as part of the West, in 1993, Slovakia became independent, and it became independent not due to its own efforts, but due to the Czech initiative. The Czechs wanted the disruption of Slovakia, and they did it excellently. They disrupted Czechoslovakia, and they blamed Slovaks for separatism, which is very clever. Anyway, it was not the first attempt at Slovak independence. We experienced such an attempt in 1939 when the first pro-Nazi Slovak Republic appeared. But after the war, after 1945, Slovakia, as a fascist state, joined the winners, joined the coalition, the anti-fascist coalition, and became a part of Czechoslovakia, which was changed in 1993. Of course, that Czechs and Slovaks are two peoples. One can argue who is more pro-Western or pro-Eastern. Slovakia is geographically shifted more to the east. But anyway, it's part of Hungary, and Hungary has been regarded all the time as a Western nation, and we have been part of Hungary for 1,000 years. So that from this point of view, that's the historical point of view, yes, Slovakia is part of the West. But that's not what I wanted to say, because that's what you can read in textbooks or somewhere else. Anyway, these two nations have two quite different histories. It's Western histories. It's in fact really something we solved, because it's a dilemma, East or West. We have solved with the help of the term Central Europe. Central Europe is something in between West and East. We came back to this term at the beginning of the 90s to tell the world we are not the East. We are in fact something between East and West, so that we are practically a part of the West, which was not accepted fully at the time, I mean at the beginning of the 90s, but this term has repeated itself and found its materialization in the Visegrad Four. It is Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians now are in this group, and simply surprisingly, this group has survived all the traps of history. Proceeding further, we have got in foreign policy problems with foreign policy orientation after 1993. At that time, it was claimed by many people, by many politicians, even by Henry Kissinger, who was at that time an old grey man. I am not sure if he was elected as one of the most sexy men of the United States. But he had respect at the time, and he simply visited Central Europe and advised us not to join NATO, not to join the EU, simply to become neutral. What the Slovaks practically didn't reject. The Czechs did, the Poles did, the Hungarians did, not the Slovaks. It was a good idea for them. And the foreign policy was at that time very pro-Russian, so that Slovakia supported Russia practically in all foreign policy steps, in the energy policy. Of course, it was a bit evasive, but it generally followed the line of the then Russian President Yeltsin. It is still difficult to gather information or uninformed data conforming to the thesis about a possible European identity of Slovakia or of any other country in this region. Are we Slovaks? Are we Europeans? Are we something else? This question was resolved with one stroke, with one strike, by now late Czech President Václav Havel, who answered the question, "What's your identity, Mr. Havel, Mr. President? Are you a Czech? Are you a European? Are you a citizen of Prague?" And his answer was perfect. He answered, "I am a Euro-Atlanticist." So that it's in fact an identity based on cooperation between Europe and the United States. which was a great thing. But let's realize that it was shortly before the Czech Republic joined NATO, so that there was a discussion there. But in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and in Poland, there were no anti-voices countering the integration into NATO. In Slovakia, yes. Slovakia was the only country of Central Europe which rejected the integration into NATO at the level of opinion polls for several years. We managed to change the situation, I believe, in 1999, when, according to many opinion polls, we could find out that 51% of Slovaks support NATO. Just a combination of many opinion polls. Fortunately, being in the Visegrad group, we can state that this group is ideal for close cooperation, and even from the research point is ideal for comparison. That's in fact very close, so that you don't have these problems like comparing Slovakia and Romania, or comparing Hungary and Bulgaria. You are in one region, and the EU in fact supports regional cooperation. It makes the life of the EU easier simply to see that the countries cooperate, be it in the north, be it in Benelux or somewhere else like Visegrad. Anyway, we have to raise some questions. Can the Central European or Central Eastern European, that's an eternal strife, how to call Central Europe, is Slovenia Central Europe, is Romania Central Europe, so that I preferred the term Central Eastern Europe to avoid the term Eastern Europe, because for the Western observers we are still Eastern Europe, but we became members of NATO, we turned into the West, we are NATO members, so that politically, yes, Slovakia is part of the West. Definitely. I'm not sure if forever, because the Slovak foreign policy has changed many times, and now it's inclining more or less to the Russian position in the discussion about Ukraine, so that there is a big difference between declarations on one side and the real political output on the other side. Slovakia supports Russia, Slovakia supports Serbia, Slovakia has not recognized as one of 5 countries in the EU the independence of Kosovo. Slovakia has supported the Russian energy policy and was more or less critical towards Ukraine. For all this turmoil, the clash between Ukraine and Russia has produced. But the question is, how can the Visegrad countries contribute to a consensus building in EU and NATO? And that's the question we should raise all the times. Anyway, the Visegrad is part of the West. I'm not sure if any colleague from the Czech Republic is here, but let's realize that about a month ago, a Czech general became the chief of North Atlantic Council. That's the highest position in NATO. So, Secretary General of NATO, it's 0. But, well, the chief of NAC, that's somebody. That's something. And, well, a Czech won this position. Even a former communist, a former collaborator with the counterintelligence. But he deserved his position due to his activity in Iraq and Afghanistan and due to his capabilities. Slovakia, I am just, how many minutes do I have? 15, okay. So that if you look into the character of the Slovak public opinion, we can still discern, due to the publication that has been published since years, each year, and that the so-called transatlantic trends, published by IVO. It's not by me, but IVO is Institute for Public Affairs in Bratislava. And they simply collect data from all European countries. These countries are selected, of course. In fact, it's NATO countries, because Turkey is included too in this survey practically each year. And well, Slovakia is one of the countries where the anti-Americanism is practically the most intensive factor defining the thinking of the Slovak population. So that Americans are not welcome in Slovakia. The same concerns Zionism, but here it is very complicated to measure it against something, because if you are anti-Zionist, if you are anti-Semite, you can hide behind anti-Zionism. So that it was like 6 years ago, you were anti-American, but you didn't say so. You said, I am anti-Bush, I am not anti-American. Now you are anti-Zionist, you are not anti-Semite. The identity of Slovakia is, in this respect, very interesting, like in Hungary, like in Poland. Maybe not so much in Poland, but in Slovakia, surely, because we have a large minority still, Hungarian minority. And the identity is a composition of several factors. So that if the people, in many opinion polls, have been asked, what's your main identity? So they, of course, responded, Slovakhood, I am Slovak. Then they differed. Well, I am also a European. The third identity factor is regional identity. I come from Eastern Slovakia, from Northern Slovakia. We still have these historical regions. The Czechs don't have. In the Czechlands, in Moravia maybe. And it's religious identity. It's mostly Roman Catholic versus Lutherans. That's the main denominations. Of course, the Roman Catholics leading with 60% of Slovaks believe, simply are Roman Catholics, at least traditionally. So that the question which can be drawn from this comparison is if Slovakia can become a Western nation. And here it's $1 million question. Let's say that yes. Yes, but we have to, of course, to define once more what does it mean the West? What does it mean Westernization? If you look into the business of consumers and into this sphere, then Slovakia is fully Western. It's a typical Western country. What in fact keeps Slovakia above the water is that we have got regional cooperation. It is Visegrad 4. And Visegrad 4, surprisingly, has survived since its beginning in 1991 or so. Many forecasted that it will disappear from year to year. Once the Poles left the Visegrad group, then it was the Hungarians, but they came back, they returned, because they simply have regional interests. Anyway, until 2016, for the first time, a Visegrad battle group should be formed. I am very skeptical about this because there are very many projects as to Visegrad. There was the modernization of Mi helicopters, Mi-17. There was a common sky with the Czech Republic, which crashed due to some legal questions. The helicopters project crashed because the Poles wanted simply to play the main role in business. And we had some more projects. One of these projects is now the battle group, but nobody can tell you if the battle group is going to be built by 2016. What we managed to do immediately is to build up the commander structures. Well, we have commanders. Well, many of them. But what's with the rank and file, it's more complicated. But I can see that I became unpopular with the moderator, so that I should come to a conclusion, and I would like to make the conclusion a bit optimistic. I feel like the last husband of Elizabeth Taylor. I know that I should do it, or I don't know how to do it, but I want to do it good. So that, well, Slovakia is part of the West. Let's summarize. In foreign policy, it's moderately supporting Russia. In foreign policy, but on the other way, it's supporting Israel. So that in this way, it's outweighed. And of course, there is geographical curse, which is we lost the buffer zone. Ukraine used to be the buffer zone. We lost it, and now, of course, we are afraid of not of the war. That's what the Russians will not. It was the topic of the first panel. The Russians will not dare, of course, to attack or to annex Ukraine. They are satisfied with Donetsk and Luhansk, and they will be happy if this country, if these republics remain in Ukraine, because they will have leverage to direct, to influence the Ukrainian foreign policy. But now, of course, Slovakia, like Hungary, like Poland, is on the border. The buffer zone starts to disappear, and maybe that's the positive news.
Thank you. I think we had left 15 minutes to discuss, hereby an open discussion. I would like to invite the audience to take questions, express comments, please.
Thank you to all the presenters. Very, very interesting presentations that fit together well. The question, Catalina, I particularly want to thank you both for highlighting the role of the émigrés, and as did others, but also for mentioning in particular Alfred Reich's book, which I too would strongly recommend to people to read. The question I have for all, it could be for any or all of the presenters, would be in looking at the state security records of the different Soviet bloc countries, I found that especially the Counterintelligence Directorate spent a lot of its time trying to combat the émigré organizations. And as I've listened to your presentations today, it sounds like maybe they had good reason to do that. That is, they were combating organizations that from their perspective were quite a potential threat to the regime. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you think they understood the state security organs in these countries understood the full range of what these émigré entities were actually doing?
Okay. I think they realized that essentially they provided an enormous threat because they couldn't fully control communication to these countries, and these United Émigré organization mounted a very strong case for life is better in the West. Our way of life is a lot better than what you've got behind the Iron Curtain, and that message was clear. As an example, I found in the Hungarian National Council archives, I found a letter Andrei Bajcsy is a great hero and a martyr in Hungarian eyes, and his widow in 1956 writes a letter, September 13th, 1956, writes a letter to Paul Auer in the Hungarian National Council Paris office asking for aid packages. I think there was a profound influence, and in terms of retribution and action against, we know that the Common Forum in 1951 sent a team of assassins to New York to attempt to assassinate Béla Varga. There's evidence of that. So they took it seriously.
If I may add something, going through the IPN archives in Poland, and I've done some research here in Hungary as well, it seems like there's a change. It depends when you're looking at monitoring of the exile activities. In the mid-1950s, there was an attempt to kidnap Stefan Kogboński. There were actually two attempts to kidnap him. First, when he was escaping already in Stockholm. The other one happened in Berlin. When he came to West Berlin, a former colleague of his from the Warsaw Uprising times was actually luring him into a trap, and last moment they left the subway one stop too early, and this saved his life probably. But then when you go through the archives, not only is it striking that they are listed as foreigners, given the fact that they really strove to maintain their legitimacy by of course, they were stripped of their citizenship, but they never adopted the American citizenship. The fact that when you go through the secret security archives and you find them as foreigners, listed as foreigners, that's striking. By the 1960s, the cases are closed. They don't find them as influential as we would like them to be seen. And it's interesting that the 1940s, especially I'm talking about the Polish archives by now, the 1940s wave is found as not having a tremendous impact. Having said that, different is the story with the people who work for the Radio Free Europe. And about this we know quite a bit from, say, Richard Cummings' work. So the radios were the chief enemy of the state, and not the exiles who were perceived as basically trying to live off the subsidies, the stipends that they got, having no impact. They did not appreciate the long-term influence that they eventually had.
As for myself, looking through some of the Czechoslovak files, I found that they were, to some degree, first of all, similar to what Ania said about how they referred to people. They referred to them as if they weren't even people, emigranti or immigrants, and protisocialistické živly, anti-socialist forces, right, or anti-socialist influences. And basically, they did their best to infiltrate almost every organization that they could, in Western Europe or in the United States. Now, in my view, the StB did, in fact, kidnap in Austria and bring back to Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, Social Democrat Lauschmann. They infiltrated Radio Free Europe in the 1970s, and that was the famous Minařík case. Then, of course, this case, which did not really involve anything organized by emigres or whatever, the Hathaway case, they had the department dealing with ideological diversion on this, right? And they were trying to see how this man was somehow trying to subvert the socialist order, and they were convinced that he was, even though most of the material they found in that bus was not even meant for Czechoslovakia. It wasn't even in the Czech language. A lot of it was in Bulgarian, Russian, Hungarian. There were only a few Czech pieces, So, but they were determined that this was, a case, and they needed to show also activity, keep in mind, the secret police. So they made more out of this than what it really was, and it was really a huge thing. I mean, sedition for something like this, it's ridiculous.
May I just share one more thing about the radios? We're just publishing a book on the Hungarian internal deportations of 1951 and onward. Kinga Széchenyi's book, which has already appeared in Hungarian. And in it, there is mention in the interviews that the people who were out on the Hortobágy or in the camps, various camps or wherever they were internally deported, the next day on Radio Free Europe, there were networks operating, Western intelligence networks of emigres operating in the satellite countries, because the next day on Radio Free Europe, they would, after the action occurred in whatever refugee camp against someone, the next day on Radio Free Europe, they would announce the details and announce this person was on the blacklist or whatever they called it. So the information was getting out about what was going on in Hungary, and Radio Free Europe was providing that information to the world and to the rest of the satellite countries. So I think that's another important aspect of this interaction with internal security in these countries. They were very afraid, and they really never were able to locate the network. In this particular case, they were never able to locate the networks or the radios. I'm doing some research on the pond, and I'm working on intelligence network that Eckhart ran along with John Grumbach Tibor Eckhart ran along with John Grumbach from 1942 to 1954, and there were lines working behind the Iron Curtain.
So, responding to the question or to the topic which was raised here, security. Security was in fact the cover word. The security in Central Europe is, I believe now, secured, is guaranteed. Without any exaggeration, it's due to the NATO membership, because security has many meanings, but if you mean external security, political, military, or politico-military security, in this respect, NATO proved to be a deterrent, proved to be something which simply can keep the Russians away from the borders of Central Europe. By the way, Slovakia, like the other countries, NATO members, is simply under the Article number 5, so that's the Three Musketeers principle. And Russia has never dared to attack any NATO country. It of course promised it is going to free the working class in the capitalist countries, but has never, Russia or the Soviet Union has never dared to attack any country militarily. Subversively, yes, but not militarily. So that in this respect, I believe Central Europe seems to be safe and secure. Unlike Ukraine is under the NUC, NATO Ukraine Commission. Ukraine is only covered by the Article number 4, which enables Ukraine to consult, to discuss its security problems with NATO. But at the very beginning, after the Crimea adventure of the Russians, the American president told openly, we are not going to war because of Ukraine. So that Ukraine is unhappily alone. Slovakia is, of course, in foreign policy terms, in hard policy, it's secure, it's safe. It's even possible to say that no terrorist attacks are expected in Slovakia, and this is due to the fact that the Arab and Muslim population in Slovakia is very limited, because mostly the more Muslims, that's not a racist statement, the more Muslims in any country, the more danger appears as to terrorist attacks. The Russians have their experience with this. Slovakia has about 3,000 to 4,000 Muslims living in this country, and Slovakia is practically a racist state as to granting citizenship to immigrants from other parts of the world, so that if you can count it, due to Statistical Bureau of the Slovak Republic, each year about 7 to 8 persons are granted citizenship of Slovakia. Just compare this with Austria, which is a neighborhood country. Well, they grant citizenship about to 8,000 to 9,000 people a year. And it's practically a country with almost the same size of the population. So that even from this point of view, I believe, and I hope I will not be disappointed, that Slovakia's security is guaranteed at this moment.
If I may add just one more thing to the Polish secret security services monitoring the activities of the exiles that I study, which is the the Assembly of Captive European Nations. I want to add that they did have the files on different members of the assembly, not only on the Poles. I found the file on Brutus Costa, but I even got his last name wrong. There was a file they had on John Richardson, the chairman of the Free Europe Committee. And this was just basic information. They just wanted to see what they were doing. They did not evaluate the impact as being a tremendous one, but this does not mean that they didn't have active agents among the emigres. They wanted to make the schisms deeper. They wanted to divide the immigration even though they were not needed to achieve that. And secondly, in this propaganda war, they really tried to encourage some of the emigre leaders to go back. And that was one of their, if there was anybody who was getting older, especially by 1970s, thinking about going back, they thought that this was the great opportunity in this propaganda war for them to score a goal, not really to stop them from working, but to actually turn them over and make them go back to Poland, proving that this is a country that is okay and it welcomes the leaders back. And of course, one thing I forgot to mention is it's a different story when we look at London, at the government, and it's completely a different milieu that should be discussed here. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have time for one question, one more. One more.
Quick comment to what you had just finished on there. It's in line with, I found a document in the Institute of National Remembrance Archive in Warsaw that dealt with what is now my center at Harvard. It was written by a state security colonel, or security service colonel, but he was writing clearly on what had been information provided to him by Polish exchange students or exchange scholars at Harvard. And using that information, he in particular was focusing on the fairly substantial number of Polish-born professors who were at that center. It was then called the Russian Research Center. And people like Adam Ulam and Dick Pipes and others. So what was interesting, though, a lot of the basic factual information was correct, because I was easily able to check that. But at this particular time, it was in 1968, and so it was heavily skewed by the anti-Semitic campaign. And in particular, they were focusing on which ones were Jews and which ones weren't. And so it was basically not only a useless document for whoever received it, but it actually, I think, gave them a grossly misleading impression of the center.
Nobody. Okay. As I can see, no questions. Then
It was in fact not a question; it was a comment.
Okay. Okay. I close this section and I give back key role to.